explained that the British have often been a little bit coy about thinking of the early Celtic and Anglo-Saxon fathers as if they were really patristic figures. You know, that in a way, patristic figures really live in the Mediterranean. They don't really live up in the north of Europe. But actually, really, these people are conceived in such a way. St. Columbanus' letter to Gregory the Great, written in 600 AD, is a very interesting example of this. Columbanus, Columba the Younger, as he was, Columbanus is a diminutive form of the same name, of Columba. Interestingly, he himself, though he doesn't use this name, he describes himself as Bar Jonah, which is a diminutive of Jonah, but Columba and Jonah mean the same thing. I mean, Jonah is the Hebrew, Columba is the Latin. Okay? But that's a diminutive as well. And giving a diminutive name is a sign of respect. Columbanus knows that he is not the main Columba, the older one is the one who lives in Iona. And again, I want to just emphasise here how much what Derwas Chitty in his book The Desert, a City puts rather nicely, the mutual confidence of the fathers, the idea in a way that these early monastic founders are knowledgeable about each other, they know how they relate to each other, and this is exactly the sort of thing that does that. But here we have Columbanus writing to Gregory the Great, again an enormously important patristic figure in the West, and Columbanus writes to him. Often people interpret this letter as being quite cheeky, but actually really this is partly about Columbanus' own conception of the importance of his own church. It's also about probably the way in which a Western father would write to the Pope in the 600s compared to later on. But in this letter, he talks about the problem of monks who are running away to the desert, the idea of impugning their first profession and in disobedience going to live with more austere masters. And he says, our own writers, Finian and Gildas, wrote about this and came up with important conclusions on this. We do have Gildas's and Finian's comments on this also survive for us elsewhere. What's important here is that Columbanus is a man who has come from Ireland to the continent. Here he is writing to the principal apostolic figure of the Western Church, telling him what a British father has said about the problem of running to the desert. In other words, he's not just looking and saying, you tell me what we should do. We've got our own fathers, and our own fathers have come up with ideas about this. Because the one thing we know about up in the northwest is about the desert. We live in the desert. We have this tradition. And what's important about this letter is it's also positioning something very important. The seminal concept of the Celtic monastic tradition of peregrinatio, of the peregrinatio is the Latin word meaning, well, it gives us, of course, via French and by dissimulation of the letters there, it gives us pilgrimage in French today as a word, pèlerinage, and then into English as pilgrimage. But really in the early church, what it means more to be a peregrinus is to be a person who has put aside the material things of one's upbringing, one's own family connections, and entered into a life with Christ. But for the Irish, it also takes on the idea that to enter into such a life, you really need to also go away somewhere. You know, you need to actually go out. So you're not just like, it's not just like in the sense that St. Augustine has it, that being a Christian is being a peregrinus, because in a way you sort of left material things behind. I always like to say it's a bit like being a renter rather than an owner. You know, that you sort of become a person who's passing through the world. But for the Irish, they also translated it this idea that a real peregrinus is someone who goes and lives in the desert. They go out somewhere. But the point about that is there's a right way and a wrong way to doing it. People talk about the wandering monks, the wanderlust of the monks in the West, Celtic tradition, but actually this is not the case. This is only really as an extension of the idea of being a hermit. To be the right sort of peregrinus, you've got to be doing it with the authority of your confessor. So he's writing about the ones who are not doing it the right way. But Columbanus himself is a peregrinus. He's come from Ireland to live in France. But he's done that with the permission of his confessor. He's done it the right way. And I emphasise that to say that he would hold himself up, as would a lot of the Celtic fathers, as being a person who has authority in these things, partly because He and his own people are people who do a lot of this. They live on the edge, they are going out into the ocean, they are going out into the wilderness. They are desert fathers of their own sort in their own conception.